My parents canceled my 19th birthday just to keep my spoiled brother from throwing a tantrum. My younger brother, who has high-functioning autism, was excessively spoiled by our parents, to the point where they once canceled my birthday to avoid upsetting him. I was 13 years old, and it was supposed to be one of the few days that revolved around me. Instead, my parents decided it wasn't worth the risk of my brother throwing a tantrum. My brother, 7 years younger than me, had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism at the age of 5. While he seemed typical in many ways, my parents used his diagnosis to justify spoiling him endlessly. Almost everything in our home revolved around his wants and needs. If I had something, my brother had to have it too, duplicates of toys, gadgets, you name it. If he had something I didn't, he'd flaunt it to provoke me. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a way of life in our household. When I turned 12, I begged for a Nintendo 3DS for my birthday. I got it, but with a caveat: I had to lend it to my brother whenever he wanted, or my parents would take it away entirely. This happened often, leaving me frustrated and powerless. My aunt, who saw one of these incidents firsthand, scolded my parents for their blatant favoritism. They gave the 3DS back to me that day, but it didn't take long for them to buy my brother his own as a surprise gift, ensuring he wouldn't feel left out. Birthdays were especially contentious in our house. If the celebration wasn't about my brother, he'd throw a fit. On my 14th birthday, my parents asked me to let my brother blow out my candles, because he was pouting and upset. When I refused, they called me selfish and a spoiled brat. Thankfully, my aunt intervened again, pointing out how much favoritism my brother received and how unfair it was to me. My parents begrudgingly let me blow out my candles, but the tension lingered. My brother, enraged, tried to spit on my cake out of spite, but my aunt blocked him just in time. That year, my aunt took over the party, ensuring I got to celebrate without more drama. My parents promised never to ask me to let my brother blow out my candles again, but their enthusiasm for my birthdays clearly waned. The following year, when I was 15, my parents sat me down a couple of weeks before my birthday to tell me they were canceling my party altogether. They said I'd still get some gifts and a cake, but there would be no celebration to avoid triggering my brother's meltdowns. I was devastated and angry, but they shrugged it off as if it were no big deal. Furious, I told my friends, teachers, and even my school counselor. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before my parents started receiving messages from their friends and other parents, questioning their decision. My dad, visibly embarrassed, ungrounded me after hearing the backlash, though he offered no apology or explanation. I assumed the party was still cancelled, especially as my brother kept mocking me about it, but to my surprise, my parents threw a last-minute surprise party for me at my favorite restaurant. It was clear they were trying to save face after the backlash. While I enjoyed the party, it was hard to ignore that it wasn't their original intention. They spent a fortune on the celebration, complete with an arcade and even a PS5 as a gift, something I had wanted for months. My brother, predictably, threw a tantrum about the attention not being on him, attempting to ruin the cake and presents. For once, my parents stood firm and gave him a timeout, but only because they were surrounded by other adults who wouldn't tolerate his behavior. My mom eventually had to take him to a McDonald's play area, just to keep him away from the party. After that year, my birthdays became much simpler. My parents never again tried to cancel my celebrations, but they made it clear they weren't going out of their way to make them special either. The parties were modest: pizza at a local parlor, a basic cake without my name on it, and no extravagant gifts. My aunt, always an advocate for fairness, pointed out the lack of effort each year, but my parents brushed it off, claiming they forgot to decorate the cake. I suspected the truth was that my brother refused to eat cake with someone else's name on it, and my parents didn't want to risk upsetting him. Despite everything, those simpler birthdays still felt like victories. For once, I had a day that was truly about me. The rest of my life at home continued to revolve around my brother's needs and tantrums, but on my birthdays, my parents couldn't take that away from me anymore. When I moved out at 18, I took my PS4 with me, something my brother was furious about. He threw a massive fit until my parents bought him his own, cementing their pattern of enabling him. Now, years later, my parents are starting to feel the consequences of their choices. On his 15th birthday, my brother went into a rage when he didn't get a PS6, causing thousands of dollars in damage to their home. My aunt told me my parents confided in her that they wished they could send him to military school or a boarding program, but they can't afford it. The irony is hard to ignore. They created this situation, and now they're trapped in it. My parents once dragged me along to a birthday party I didn't want to attend, simply because my younger brother had been invited. I would have much preferred to stay home and play video games, but as usual, my parents insisted. Sitting off to the side for most of the event, I witnessed the entire disaster unfold. It began innocently enough with my brother picking up gifts from the table and shaking them like he was unwrapping them with his mind. The birthday boy's mother stepped in, firmly telling him to stop, but my parents rushed to his defense, claiming he was harmless. The woman wasn't having it. She clearly knew my brother's reputation and made my parents move him away from the gifts. The kids started playing party games, and the birthday boy, rightfully, got first pick and turn on everything. This was a birthday, after all. My brother, however, couldn't handle it. Each time it wasn't his turn, he threw a tantrum, loudly complaining and stomping his feet. My parents, undeterred, approached the mother again, asking if my brother could go first instead. Her refusal was immediate, and she warned them to get my brother under control or we'd all be asked to leave. Then came the cake. As the mother lit the candles and the adults started singing, my brother exploded into a full-blown meltdown when the song reached the part where they sang the birthday boy's name. He grabbed the side of the table and began shaking it violently, nearly toppling everything onto the floor. My parents had to physically restrain him for a moment before my mom went back to the birthday boy's mother, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. I later found out that my mom had asked if my brother could blow out the candles first, promising they'd redo the song afterward. The mother was understandably disgusted and told my mom it was best if we left. Returning to the table, she tried to restart the birthday song, but my brother, unable to take the attention being off him, sprinted to the table. Before anyone could stop him, he shoved the cake into the birthday boy's face, using his arm like a battering ram. For a moment, the entire room went silent. Then, some of the kids started laughing while the birthday boy burst into tears. The adults were stunned, except for my parents, who seemed more concerned with coddling my brother. My mom hugged him tightly, saying the whole situation could have been avoided if they had just let him blow out the candles first. The birthday boy's mother was livid as she tried to clean chocolate cake off her crying son. She screamed at my parents to leave immediately. The other kids began crying when they realized there was no longer a cake to enjoy. As my mom tried to drag my brother out, he broke free, ran to the gift table, and pushed it over, sending presents scattering everywhere. That's when I stepped in, grabbing him and holding him in a headlock until my parents pulled him away. Embarrassed beyond belief, I apologized profusely to the birthday boy's mother. At 13 years old, I was apologizing for my parents' behavior, not just my brother's. My dad barked at me to get moving or to walk home. Furious, I told him I'd walk, as the party was just down the street. Instead of leaving, I stayed to help clean up the mess my brother had caused. The birthday boy's mother was grateful and called me a good egg, contrasting me with my brother, who she said was just rotten. Someone went out to get another cake while the birthday boy showered off the mess. The rest of the party salvaged what it could, and they redid the birthday song. Before leaving, the birthday boy's mother handed me a handwritten invoice for my parents, detailing the cost of the destroyed cake and a warning that someone had recorded the entire incident on video. When I gave the invoice to my parents, they were livid. My dad handed me cash, telling me to take it back to the woman, which I did. That was the last time that family ever associated with mine. Sadly, a similar incident happened months later at another birthday party. My mom asked if my brother could blow out the candles first, giving the same excuses. The parents refused, and my brother attempted to knock over the cake again. This time, I was on guard and stopped him. We were promptly told to leave. After that, my brother was no longer invited to any birthday parties outside of the family. On my 14th birthday later that year, my parents again tried to convince me to let my brother blow out my candles. My aunt stepped in and tore into them, calling out their favoritism. That's when I realized they'd decided that if I couldn't share my birthday, I wouldn't get a party at all the following year, a decision that backfired spectacularly, as anyone who's read my earlier posts would know. My younger brother's destructive tendencies weren't limited to just his behavior at parties. He treated his belongings with the same recklessness. His BMX bike was a prime example. Every time he broke it, I was the one called over to fix it. Flat tires, new pedals, damaged handlebars, snapped brake lines, you name it, I fixed it. My parents spent hundreds of dollars on that stunt bike because he begged for it, but he never took care of it properly. They bought him all the parts and even had the tools at home, but he would do little more than pump the tires occasionally, and even then, he tried to get someone else to do it for him. His carelessness was constant. Once, he left the bike in a neighbor's driveway, and the handlebars got crushed under the neighbor's van. Another time, he broke the brake line during one of his tantrums. The tire wear was understandable since he used it frequently, but having to replace it myself on a hot Saturday afternoon felt like the last straw. He was perfectly capable of fixing it himself, but he never even tried. So when it came to my mini bike, there was no way I was letting him take it for a joyride. I knew he'd treat it the same way he treated everything else, and with gas prices being what they were, I wasn't about to waste fuel on his recklessness. About a month before my brother's 15th birthday, my parents called me over to fix his BMX again. The rear tire was worn down to the threads. Annoyed, I only agreed because they offered to pay me. It was blisteringly hot, over 100 degrees, and after swapping the tire, I sat down for some water, exhausted. My brother stood nearby, watching me work, helmet already on. I figured he was just eager to ride his bike. But as soon as my back was turned, I heard the unmistakable roar of my mini bike starting up outside. By the time I ran out of the garage, he was already tearing down the street on my mini bike like a rocket. I was furious. My parents tried to downplay the situation, promising to get the bike back when he returned. I wanted to call the police, but wasn't sure if it would be considered a domestic issue. My brother eventually came back an hour later, miraculously unscathed. But when he saw me standing there, he revved the engine and took off again, before I could stop him. He didn't return until the mini bike ran out of gas, forcing my parents to retrieve him. To say I was livid would be an understatement. My parents rolled their eyes, handed me $140, and claimed it wouldn't happen again. I warned them that if it did, I would call the cops next time. Whether the warning had any real effect, I'm not sure, but they seemed to take me seriously. I had to push my mini bike to the nearest gas station to refill it before I could go home. Before leaving, I told my parents that if my brother wanted a mini bike so badly, they should buy him one themselves. Their response was infuriatingly hypocritical. They said he wasn't ready for the responsibility and that it was too dangerous because it was practically a motorcycle. Yet, they had no problem letting him steal mine for 2 hours of joyriding. The last time I visited my parents, my brother was grounded for his infamous birthday rampage. Just to be safe, I pulled the spark plug wire from my mini bike before going inside. As I left, my brother glared at me from his bedroom window, seething. I couldn't resist giving him a goofy wave before driving off. Things took an unexpected turn when I suggested to my parents that they sell some of my brother's belongings to recoup the damages from his tantrum. To my surprise, they agreed without hesitation, as if it was a light bulb moment for them. Over the weekend, they held a massive garage sale, clearing out a significant portion of his possessions. The sale was extensive. They sold his BMX, his video game systems, and just about anything else of value. The sheer number of consoles he had accumulated over the years was staggering: a GameCube, a Wii, a 3DS, a Switch, a PS2, a PS3, a PS4, an Xbox 360, an Xbox One, and an impressive collection of games. Everything went. They also sold his TV, RC cars, drone, and even his gaming PC, which they listed online. His room was stripped down to the essentials. While I was visiting during the sale, I could hear my brother crying loudly from his room. It was so over the top that it was obviously fake. My parents, for once, didn't fall for it. I asked them if they had started taking him to therapy, and they admitted they had no choice. They even acknowledged that all of this was their fault for enabling him for so long. I didn't rub it in, but I could tell by the look on their faces that they knew I could have. Friends and family had been warning them for years, but they'd stayed in denial until now. The garage sale was a wake-up call for my parents. Selling my brother's belongings didn't just help them recover some of their losses, it forced them to confront the consequences of years of coddling and enabling. As for my brother, his tantrums continued, but for the first time, my parents were no longer indulging them. Whether this marks a real turning point for them remains to be seen, but at least they've finally started to acknowledge the monster they helped create. Now that my parents have started to realize the consequences of years of spoiling my brother, they're beginning to understand what many of us warned them about: their overindulgence would backfire. Not only has it created a toxic dynamic in the family, but it's left my brother woefully unprepared for adulthood. They've admitted they worry he may never be capable of functioning independently, expecting someone to cater to his every need for the rest of his life. And while I empathize with their predicament, I've made it clear, I will not be his caretaker when they are too old to handle him. Despite these realizations, my brother hasn't shown much improvement. Over the next few weeks, he continued his bratty behavior, fake crying when he didn't get his way and getting into trouble at school. The most recent incident involved him stealing another kid's cell phone, hiding in his closet to play on it. My parents had to return the phone to the school and identify its owner, thoroughly embarrassed in the process. Last week, I came up with an idea, a family intervention. When I brought it up, my parents were hesitant, probably because they knew it would expose both their failures and my brother's behavior. Still, they reluctantly agreed. On the next available day, close family members and a few friends gathered at my parents' house, forming a circle of chairs in the living room. At first, my brother wasn't present. We started with my parents. My aunt, always vocal about my parents' favoritism, was the first to speak. She had written an entire speech, which she delivered with passion. My parents tried to interject a few times but were quickly silenced. When my turn came, I read my own prepared speech, detailing everything I'd shared here and more. My grandparents followed, as did the others, one by one. By the end, my mother was in tears, and my father sat silently, holding her. They both apologized to me, admitting they had been terrible parents and that they had ruined my childhood. It was a powerful moment, but my aunt was quick to point out that it should never have come to this for them to realize their mistakes. She emphasized the need for them to do better, not just for my sake, but especially for my brother's, so he could have a chance at becoming a functioning adult. When my brother was finally brought into the room, he was seated away from my parents, to prevent my mom from coddling him. The family laid into him, each member taking their turn to confront him about his behavior. My brother fought back with excuses, mostly variations of "if they just let me have my way, none of this would happen." It didn't take long for the group to dismantle that logic, explaining to him that the world doesn't work that way. When he realized no one was taking his side, he tried his usual antics, huffing, pretending to hyperventilate, and dramatically collapsing to the floor. My aunt, unimpressed, told him to stop milking it and get up. Enraged, he screamed that we were all ruining his life and that he wished we were dead. My parents were horrified. Despite his outburst, no one coddled him. Instead, they continued to make their points, speaking directly to him as he lay on the floor. Eventually, the intervention ended, and people began leaving. My brother refused to move, forcing my parents to drag him back to his room. He wasn't used to this level of accountability, especially from our parents, and it showed. This intervention was just the beginning of what I know will be a long uphill battle. My aunt has generously offered to contribute toward therapy for my brother, and my parents have taken her up on it. It's a step in the right direction, though whether it leads to real change remains to be seen. Since the intervention, my parents have taken some steps to rein in my brother's behavior. They promised to host my next birthday properly, complete with my favorite cake, one with my name on it, no less. My brother overheard this while washing dishes, a new chore he's been assigned, and immediately retreated to his room, shutting down completely. No fake crying this time, just a quiet withdrawal. In an attempt to reward him for good behavior, my parents decided to give him some privileges, though they were far from the lavish ones he was used to. My dad dug out his old N64 and Game Boy Color from the 90s, along with a small CRT TV, to set up in my brother's room. When they offered it to him, he complained bitterly about how old and boring they were. My dad, unimpressed, told him he could suit himself or go back to reading. Unsurprisingly, it took less than a day for my brother to start begging to have the older systems, desperate for something to occupy himself. Now, my brother spends his days yelling at Mario 64 on the ancient CRT, frustrated by the outdated graphics and lack of internet walkthroughs. The Game Boy Color, loaded with Pokémon and Donkey Kong, became his new obsession, though the need for AA batteries led my parents to buy him a power cord instead. They promised him a Game Boy Advance if he behaves well all summer, but he's only earned one CD of burned music so far. A new system seems far off. To give him a way to exercise, my dad also found a used stationary bike on Facebook Marketplace and set it up in my brother's room, alongside an old CD player. Watching him ride it is almost unsettling. He pedals with such intensity that it looks more like rage than exercise, glaring at the walls as if plotting revenge. When I mentioned this to my parents, they admitted they had similar concerns, but didn't know what else to do. Whenever I visit, my brother doesn't say much. He glares at me as I leave on my mini bike, his face filled with envy. It's a look that seems to say, just wait until I'm 18. While I've tried to talk to him and even spend time playing games together, he's distant and aggressive. Playing Mario Kart on the N64, he swings the controller wildly and has even shoved me a few times when he loses. This journey is far from over, but for the first time, my parents are taking real steps to address the damage they've caused. Whether it's enough remains to be seen. As for my brother, only time will tell if he can rise above the entitlement and learn to live in the real world. I've learned to brace myself when playing games with my brother so he can't shove me over when he gets frustrated. He's had a few minor tantrums while losing, but is starting to improve, albeit slowly. To help ease his frustration, I printed game FAQs, walkthroughs, and cheat codes for some of the N64 games he's been playing. I put them in a binder, which has helped him calm down and even be a bit nicer to me. Recently, my parents discussed setting up summer homeschooling for my brother, thinking it would be a productive way to keep him busy. I warned them against it, pointing out that he was already in a near-constant state of anger and frustration. The goal, I argued, was to help him mellow out and accept that life won't always go his way, not to add more pressure and make things worse. My dad, frustrated, reminded me that he was the parent, not me. This sparked an argument where I reminded him of everything that had happened over the past decade, the favoritism, the unfair blame I endured, and even how I had to hide my money at my aunt's house because they allowed my brother to try to steal it. I didn't outright call my dad a bad parent, but my words implied it heavily. He eventually backed down, and my mom agreed with me, saying that forcing homeschooling on my brother wouldn't help. My dad seemed to shut down after that, retreating to the living room to drink alone. My mom later apologized to me again, admitting that she blames herself for coddling my brother and pushing my dad to go along with it. She said she never thought about what my brother would be like as an adult, she was too focused on keeping him as her baby. My parents have scheduled couples counseling, though the wait list means it'll be some time before they can attend. My dad isn't thrilled about it, and while he admitted his mistakes during the family intervention, he's since tried to act as though everything is normal. I've made it clear to both of them that pretending the past didn't happen won't make it go away, and thankfully, my mom agrees with me. Unfortunately, things recently took a turn I didn't expect. My mom, unable to fully hold firm on accountability, started secretly giving my brother privileges again while my dad was at work. He begged, and eventually, she relented because, as she said, he's special. This started with her buying him a used Nintendo Switch and a copy of Breath of the Wild. She also began allowing him to use his laptop again, even for non-school activities. As expected, my brother quickly became demanding. He insisted my mom replace more of the items they had sold and called her horrible names when she told him she couldn't because Dad would notice. This cycle repeated for days until my mom reached her breaking point. In a moment of complete frustration, she slapped my brother hard across the face, an action so unlike her that it shocked everyone involved. That wasn't the end of it. Overwhelmed by guilt and stress, my mom spiraled into a complete mental breakdown, resorting to self-harm. She called my dad to come home early, saying she couldn't stop hurting herself. When he arrived, he found her in a horrific state, crying, beating herself, and pulling out her hair. He had to physically restrain her to make her stop. The situation escalated further when my dad, consumed with anger and frustration, took it out on my brother. He hooped him harder than he ever had, calling him an ungrateful brat. My dad later admitted to me that he regretted his actions deeply, but at that moment, he had snapped. My mom had to be taken to the ER and placed under psychiatric evaluation. She was later hospitalized due to extreme anxiety and stress. My dad showed me a picture of her face before she was taken in, 2 black eyes, a swollen face, and patches of hair missing. It was clear she had done significant harm to herself. My dad begged me to come over and watch my brother while he managed my mom's situation. He feared my brother might do something drastic too. When I arrived, I found my brother huddled in his closet, crying. He wouldn't say much other than murmured apologies and flinched every time I moved too close. To coax him out, I ordered his favorite pizza on my own dime, barbecue chicken with stuffed crust, and we ate in silence. Later, we played Mario Kart on the N64, and eventually, he broke down sobbing. He asked me how bad of a person he really was. I hesitated but told him the truth. It wasn't his fault that he was raised spoiled, our parents were to blame for that. However, I also told him that as he got older, he couldn't rely on that excuse. I explained how his entitlement, anger, and violent tendencies were his responsibility to address now. He cried harder and asked me to leave the room. About an hour later, he came out, and we talked more in the living room. My brother asked me what it was like being an adult. I explained the responsibilities, working a job, paying bills, and budgeting what's left over. He seemed shocked. No one had ever explained these things to him before. He admitted he didn't want to grow up and liked gaming all day, but he also acknowledged that he knew it wasn't sustainable. When my dad came home, my brother bolted to his room. My dad looked like a mess, eyes red, face drawn, and he broke down apologizing to me. He admitted he's finally beginning to understand just how bad of a parent he had been. We hugged, and he cried as he poured his heart out about everything that had happened. It's been almost 2 weeks now, and my mom still hasn't come home. My dad won't say much, but I suspect she's been institutionalized as a danger to herself. My brother has calmed down significantly. He does chores without complaint and has started earning privileges back, like the Switch. He admitted over the phone that he's afraid of Dad now, though he said Dad hasn't raised his voice since the day Mom broke down. He misses the life he used to have but seems to understand, on some level, that it's gone for good. I'm at a loss for how to move forward. My family is deeply broken, and while I want to support them, I also know I can't fix everything. My brother needs this hard lesson to move forward in life, but I'm starting to feel sorry for him. At the same time, I can't condone how my dad punished him. While I don't plan to confront him about it unless it happens again, I know he regrets it deeply. This is not how I imagined things would play out when I pushed for change in my family. I knew it would be dramatic, but I didn't think it would reach this level. Now I can only hope that we can rebuild from here.